August 20, 1942. Guadalcanal. The Pacific air is thick with humidity and the distant rumble of artillery. On the battered beach, a U.S. Navy transport ship lowers its ramp, and a machine unlike anything the Japanese defenders have ever seen rumbles onto the sand. It's a Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, painted navy gray, its blade wide enough to clear a path through the densest jungle. The engine growls, diesel fumes mixing with the salty air. For the Americans, it's just another piece of equipment. For the Japanese, it's the beginning of a revelation. Watching from behind the wire of a prisoner enclosure is Lieutenant Taishi Yamamoto. Just days earlier, he was an Imperial Japanese Army engineer, trained at Waseda University, conscripted when the Empire needed every educated man it could find. Now, wounded and recovering from fever, he's a prisoner and observer to a new kind of war. Yamamoto's training was thorough, brutal, and built on a single principle: manpower conquers all obstacles. He'd learned to calculate how many men it took to dig a trench, build a runway, or move a ton of supplies. The math was simple: 1,000 men could build a runway in 2 weeks. 500 could construct a defensive line in 10 days. 200 could dig an anti-tank ditch in a week. These calculations were doctrine, refined through campaigns in China and the Russo-Japanese War. The human body was the fundamental unit of construction, and Japan had millions of bodies to spend. American soldiers, Yamamoto had been taught, were soft. Japanese propaganda hammered this point home: the Americans had factories, ships, and planes, but they lacked the spiritual strength for real war. Their soldiers expected comfort, their workers went on strike, and their entire civilization was built on machinery and convenience. In the end, the Japanese believed willpower would triumph over steel. Yamamoto had believed this completely. He'd seen it in Manchuria, where Japanese forces built entire military installations with hand tools and human labor. Roads through mountains, bridges over gorges, fortresses from raw earth and timber, all without a single machine, beyond the occasional truck. It was slow, backbreaking work that killed men through exhaustion and accident, but it got done. The projects were finished, the infrastructure was built. When you had enough men and could push them hard enough, machines became unnecessary luxuries. But now, standing at the wire on Guadalcanal, Yamamoto watched the bulldozer roll off the ship and felt the foundation of his understanding begin to crack. The machine moved toward a patch of dense jungle just beyond Henderson Field's perimeter. The area was scheduled to become an expanded ammunition dump. According to Japanese doctrine, this would require 200 men working for 5 days, assuming good weather, adequate tools, and acceptable casualty rates from falling trees and tropical disease. Instead, a single American operator, a Seabee in a faded khaki shirt, lit a cigarette, adjusted the controls, and released the brake. The D7 lurched forward, blade angled down, and hit the first tree, a palm as thick as a man's torso. The blade struck with a grinding shriek, and the tree toppled in seconds. The bulldozer didn't pause. It rolled over the fallen trunk, blade still down, pushing the palm aside like trash. Second tree, third tree, fourth tree. The machine advanced in a straight line, its treads chewing through undergrowth, its blade knocking down everything in its path. Yamamoto watched for 10 minutes without moving. Other Japanese prisoners gathered at the wire, drawn by the sound. They stood silently, calculating the same impossible arithmetic. The machine was doing the work of what, 50 men? 100. The operator appeared to be alone. No support crew, no laborers following to clear the debris. Just one man on one machine, erasing jungle faster than a company of soldiers with axes and saws. One of the prisoners, a sergeant named Fuya, who'd been a foreman at a construction company in Osaka, finally spoke. "How many cubic meters per hour?" He asked in Japanese, his voice distant. Yamamoto tried to calculate it. He couldn't. The rate of work was beyond the formulas he'd been taught. His engineering training had no category for this scale of mechanical efficiency. The bulldozer worked through the morning. By noon, when the operator stopped for lunch and climbed down to eat a sandwich in the shade, roughly a third of the jungle plot had been cleared. Yamamoto did the math with increasing disbelief. At this rate, the entire area would be finished in 2 days, maybe less. One machine, one operator. What would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers a week of brutal labor? this single piece of equipment was accomplishing in a fraction of the time, with zero casualties, no exhaustion breaks, no need for food distribution or medical treatment for injuries. The operator finished his sandwich, drank from a canteen, tossed the wax paper in a bin attached to the bulldozer, and climbed back up. The engine coughed and roared to life. The work resumed. By evening, the clearing was 3/4 complete. The bulldozer had worked approximately 8 hours with one break. In that time, it had removed what Yamamoto conservatively estimated would have required 1,500 man-hours of labor. He ran the numbers again, certain he'd made an error. He hadn't. The machine had literally done the work of 200 men in a single day, and this was just clearing. He hadn't even begun to consider the implications for grading, excavation, road building, all the tasks that form the backbone of military engineering. If American machines could operate at this ratio across all construction tasks, then the entire Japanese approach to logistics and infrastructure was obsolete. Not inefficient, not outdated completely, fundamentally obsolete. As the days passed, the bulldozer's relentless progress became a daily spectacle for the Japanese prisoners. Yamamoto and his fellow captives watched in silence as more machines arrived: graders, earth movers, trucks with strange attachments, and mobile workshops. The Americans were not just clearing jungle. They were transforming Guadalcanal into a small industrial city. Roads appeared where there had been only mud. Airstrips were lengthened, supply depots sprang up, and field hospitals with real beds and electricity were built in days, not months. For the Japanese, this was more than a display of engineering. It was a direct challenge to everything they had been taught about war, work, and the value of human effort. The doctrine that manpower conquers all obstacles was being demolished before their eyes. The Americans didn't just use machines, they built their entire system around them. Human labor was reserved for operating the equipment, not for breaking their backs in endless, exhausting shifts. Fuya, the former Osaka construction foreman, became obsessed with the machines. He stood at the wire for hours, mentally cataloging every task and comparing it to Japanese methods. "It's not just the machines," he whispered to Yamamoto one afternoon. "It's the system. Every step is mechanized. The bulldozer clears, the grader smooths, the trucks bring pre-cut lumber, and the crew with power tools assembles the structure. It's not just mechanical superiority, it's systematic mechanical thinking." Yamamoto understood immediately. In the Japanese military, machines were used when available, but the system was built around human labor. The Americans, by contrast, assumed mechanization as the baseline and added people only where necessary. The result was a level of efficiency that made Japanese methods look primitive. No matter how many men Tokyo could mobilize, they could never match the speed and scale of American construction. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. These were men who had been taught since childhood that hardship was a virtue, that suffering built character, and that the ability to endure was the highest form of strength. Now, they saw that all their suffering was being rendered obsolete by a machine operated by a bored American who smoked cigarettes and ate sandwiches while working. The realization was devastating. If one bulldozer could do the work of 500 men, what did that say about the 500? What did it say about the entire Japanese military system, which treated those 500 bodies as expendable resources? The prisoners began to question everything they had been told. Was their suffering really necessary? Was their sacrifice truly virtuous, or just a sign of their nation's backwardness? The Americans, meanwhile, seemed barely aware they were demonstrating anything remarkable. The Seabees worked with casual competence, treating their machines like ordinary tools. They painted names on the bulldozers: E-Crusher, Jungle King, Tokyo Express, and decorated them with pin-up girls and squadron insignias. They complained about maintenance, about the heat, about the food, but never about the difficulty of the work. For them, the machines did the hard parts. The operators just moved levers and watched as steel blades moved earth and trees. The most devastating realization for Yamamoto and the other prisoners was that the Americans had industrialized warfare to the point where reshaping the physical environment of entire islands had become routine labor. What would have taken a Japanese engineer battalion months of backbreaking work was accomplished by a handful of machines in a matter of days. 3 weeks after his capture, Yamamoto witnessed an event that completed his psychological transformation. A Japanese air raid hit Henderson Field at dawn, cratering the runway in 3 places. Yamamoto knew from his training that repairing such damage would require hundreds of men working for days. But the American response began within minutes. 2 bulldozers rolled onto the runway, followed by dump trucks and a grader. In less than 2 hours, the craters were filled, the surface was compacted, and aircraft were landing again. Yamamoto did the math. What would have taken 300 Japanese laborers to days was accomplished by 20 Americans, and a few machines in 90 minutes. The ratio wasn't 500 to 1 anymore. For specialized tasks like rapid runway repair, the mechanization advantage was closer to 1,000 to 1. The prisoners began to understand they had been lied to about everything. The propaganda that told them Americans were soft had missed the point. The Americans refused to suffer unnecessarily, not because they lacked courage, but because they valued efficiency. They built comfortable camps, not for luxury, but because healthy, well-fed troops fought better. They used machines, not because they were weak, but because machines were more effective than human muscle. The realization shattered the prisoners' sense of superiority. Some broke completely, falling into depression and silence. Others tried to adapt, learning English, asking guards about American factories, and trying to understand the industrial culture that had produced the machines they now saw as the true enemy. As the months passed on Guadalcanal, the difference between American and Japanese engineering became impossible to ignore. The U.S. Seabees and Army engineers, equipped with bulldozers, graders, cranes, and trucks, transformed the island's landscape at a pace that defied belief. Roads, airstrips, fuel depots, and hospitals appeared in weeks, not months. The Americans built not just for survival, but for dominance, creating a logistical network that could support endless waves of troops, supplies, and firepower. For the Japanese, the contrast was painful. Their own engineering units, trained to rely on human labor, struggled to keep up. Every new American construction project was a blow to morale. The prisoners in the enclosure watched as the Seabees worked through rain, heat, and darkness, their machines illuminated by portable lights powered by generators. The Americans had electricity in the jungle, mobile workshops with lathes and welding equipment, and spare parts for everything. When a bulldozer broke down, it was fixed in hours and returned to work. When a new road was needed, it was built in days. Yamamoto, the former engineering student, tried to calculate the equivalence in manpower. The psychological impact on the Japanese prisoners deepened. These were men who had been taught that hardship was a virtue, that suffering built character, and that the ability to endure was the highest form of strength. Now, they saw that all their suffering was being rendered obsolete by a machine operated by a bored American who smoked cigarettes and ate sandwiches while working. The Americans, for their part, seemed almost oblivious to the effect they were having. The Seabees treated their machines as ordinary tools, painting names and pin-up girls on the bulldozers, complaining about maintenance and food, but never about the difficulty of the work. For them, the machines did the hard parts. The operators just moved levers and watched as steel blades moved earth and trees. The most devastating realization for Yamamoto and the other prisoners was that the Americans had industrialized warfare to the point where reshaping the physical environment of entire islands had become routine labor. What would have taken a Japanese engineer battalion months of backbreaking work was accomplished by a handful of machines in a matter of days. The impact on combat was immediate. American forces could build airfields, supply depots, and defensive positions faster than the Japanese could destroy them. Every time a Japanese air raid cratered a runway, the Seabees had it repaired in hours. Every time a supply line was cut, a new one was built. The Americans could move artillery, tanks, and troops wherever they were needed, whenever they were needed. The Japanese, relying on human muscle, simply couldn't keep up. The effect on strategy was profound. Japanese plans relied on creating fortified positions that would be so costly to assault that America would negotiate a peace rather than suffer the casualties. But that logic assumed the costs would be symmetrical, that building defenses was as expensive as breaking them. American mechanization destroyed that symmetry. Japanese forces could spend months creating elaborate defensive networks, pouring human labor into bunkers and obstacles. The Americans would show up with bulldozers and flamethrower tanks and combat engineers and reduce those months of work to rubble in days. The construction cost wasn't symmetrical at all. It cost Japan far more to build defenses than it cost America to destroy them. If American Seabee battalions operated at this level of mechanical efficiency throughout the Pacific, then Japanese defensive strategy was fundamentally hopeless. Tokyo's plan relied on manpower, but the Americans had replaced manpower with machine power. The prisoners began to understand they had been fighting an unwinnable war from the beginning. The propaganda had told them Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. But this framing had disguised the real question: could spirit overcome factories? Could discipline overcome assembly lines? Could courage overcome industrial capacity measured in millions of tons of steel? The answer was no. It had always been no. As the American campaign rolled across the Pacific, the lessons of Guadalcanal became impossible to ignore. Every new island, New Georgia, Bougainville, Saipan, Tinian, Leyte became a stage for the same drama: American machines versus Japanese manpower. The Seabees and Army engineers brought their bulldozers, graders, cranes, and trucks to every landing. The result was always the same: roads, airfields, and supply depots appeared in days, not months. The Americans built, the Japanese tried to destroy, and the machines always won. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was devastating. Prisoners arriving at Guadalcanal from other islands brought stories of American construction that bordered on the unbelievable. They spoke of airfields built in weeks, bridges thrown across ravines in hours, and entire supply depots materializing as if by magic. The common thread in every story was mechanization. The Americans approached every problem with machines. They had machines for earth moving, machines for lifting, machines for cutting, machines for digging, machines for pounding, machines for smoothing. Every task had a tool, and every tool was part of a system. Yamamoto, still a prisoner, listened to these stories with a mixture of awe and despair. He realized that the Americans' advantage wasn't just in the machines themselves, but in the way they used them. The Seabees worked in shifts around the clock, their machines roaring through the night, illuminated by portable lights powered by generators. They had mobile workshops, spare parts for everything, and a system that allowed them to fix breakdowns in hours, not days. The Japanese, by contrast, relied on human labor for everything. When a machine broke, it often stayed broken. When a road washed out, it took weeks to repair. When a defensive position was destroyed, it was rebuilt by hand. The difference was philosophical as much as practical. The Japanese military saw machines as useful additions to a system built around human labor. The Americans saw machines as the foundation, with people serving as operators and supervisors. The result was a level of efficiency that made Japanese methods look primitive. No matter how many men Tokyo could mobilize, they could never match the speed and scale of American construction. The impact on Japanese strategy was profound. Defensive plans that relied on fortifications, obstacles, and prepared positions were rendered obsolete by American mechanization. The Americans could build airfields, supply lines, and defensive works faster than the Japanese could destroy them. Every time a Japanese unit spent months building a bunker or a trench network, the Americans would erase it in days with bulldozers and explosives. The effect on morale was equally significant. Japanese soldiers, raised to believe in the virtue of suffering and the power of the human spirit, now saw that their sacrifices were being rendered meaningless by machines. The old equations, how many men to dig a trench, how many hours to build a runway, no longer applied. The Americans had changed the rules of the game. Some prisoners broke under the strain. They stopped eating, stopped talking, and sat in the enclosure, staring at nothing. Others tried to adapt, learning English, asking guards about American factories, and trying to understand the industrial culture that had produced the machines they now saw as the true enemy. A few, like Yamamoto, accepted the facts with an engineer's cold comprehension. Japan had been defeated by mathematics, by the simple fact that you couldn't beat bulldozers with shovels. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed barely aware of the revolution they were causing. The Seabees treated their machines as ordinary tools, painting names and pin-up girls on the bulldozers, complaining about maintenance and food, but never about the difficulty of the work. For them, the machines did the hard parts. The operators just moved levers and watched as steel blades moved earth and trees. The stories of American mechanization spread throughout the Pacific. On New Caledonia, Seabees built a naval base in 6 months. On Espiritu Santo, they constructed a supply depot that handled more tonnage monthly than some Japanese home ports. On Saipan, they built airfields that allowed B-29s to bomb Japan itself. Every report confirmed the same pattern. American forces arrived with machines, built infrastructure at impossible speed, and established logistical superiority that made their tactical advantages overwhelming. The Japanese command, for all its talk of spirit and sacrifice, could not ignore the evidence. Reports from the front described American construction efforts that defied belief. Defensive positions that had taken months to build were destroyed in days. Supply lines that had been cut were rebuilt overnight. The Americans were not just winning battles, they were industrializing the Pacific, turning primitive coastlines into military bases faster than Japan could organize effective resistance. The realization was slow and painful. Some officers clung to the old ways, insisting that spirit would triumph in the end. Others, like Yamamoto, saw the truth. The war was being lost not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, the shipyards, and the construction sites. The Americans had built a system that could outproduce, outbuild, and outlast anything Japan could muster. When the war finally ended, the impact of American mechanization was written across the Pacific in roads, airfields, and the ruins of once formidable Japanese defenses. For Yamamoto and thousands of other Japanese prisoners, the end of the conflict brought a return to a homeland that was almost unrecognizable. The cities were bombed out shells, the factories were rubble, and the population was exhausted and hungry. The emperor's voice, heard for the first time by most Japanese in a radio broadcast, announced surrender in language so formal that many listeners barely understood it. The war was over, but the lessons of defeat were only beginning to sink in. Yamamoto returned to Tokyo and tried to resume his studies at Waseda University. The engineering department was operating out of a few undamaged buildings, using salvaged equipment and teaching students who were gaunt from malnutrition. The textbooks still taught the old methods, calculations for human labor, formulas for manual construction, and the assumption that muscle power was the basic unit of work. But Yamamoto, having seen the American machines in action, knew that everything had changed. He wanted to stand up in class and shout that the old ways were obsolete, that Japanese engineering doctrine had been proven catastrophically inadequate. He wanted to tell his professors that the Americans had bulldozed every carefully constructed defensive position Japan had built, and that the future belonged to those who could harness the power of machines. But he didn't. He sat in silence, took notes, and wondered if his country would ever learn from its defeat. Some lessons did emerge, slowly and painfully. The American occupation brought Seabees and Army engineers to Japan, where they built infrastructure for the occupation forces using the same mechanized methods Yamamoto had witnessed on Guadalcanal. Japanese laborers worked alongside the Americans, learning by watching. They saw bulldozers grade roads, cranes lift steel beams, and power tools speed construction that would have taken weeks with hand tools. The knowledge began to transfer. Japanese construction companies started to adopt American methods, importing machines when they could afford them, training operators, and redesigning projects around mechanization rather than labor. The change was slow. Japan was too poor and too devastated to fully mechanize overnight, but the direction was clear. The country was finally accepting what Yamamoto had understood since 1942. Machines were better than muscles for almost everything. Yamamoto found work as a civil engineer during the 1950s and 60s, part of Japan's reconstruction and eventual economic miracle. The nation rebuilt with mechanization, adopting American construction techniques alongside American political frameworks. Highways were built with bulldozers, buildings with cranes, earth moved with power equipment. It was faster, safer, and more efficient than the human labor methods that had dominated before the war. But the change was not just technical, it was cultural. The old virtues of suffering and sacrifice were slowly replaced by a new appreciation for efficiency, comfort, and the value of human life. The idea that hardship was a virtue, that suffering built character, began to fade. The new Japan was built on the belief that machines could do the hard work and that people should be free to innovate, create, and enjoy the fruits of their labor. For Yamamoto, the transformation was bittersweet. He had spent years believing in the old ways, only to see them swept away by the relentless advance of American machines. He knew that the change was necessary, that it was the only way for Japan to survive and thrive in the modern world. But he also mourned the loss of the old certainties, the sense of purpose that came from enduring hardship for a greater cause. The legacy of American mechanization was not just in the roads and buildings that dotted the Japanese landscape. It was in the way people thought about work, about progress, and about the future. The lessons of Guadalcanal had been learned the hard way, but they had been learned. Japan's post-war economic miracle was built on the foundation of mechanization, efficiency, and the willingness to adapt. The story of the first bulldozer on Guadalcanal became a parable for a new generation of Japanese engineers and workers. It was a reminder that the world had changed, that the old equations no longer applied, and that the future belonged to those who could harness the power of machines. The bulldozer, once a symbol of American dominance, became a symbol of Japan's own transformation. The story of the first bulldozer on Guadalcanal is more than a tale of machines and meant it as a lesson in how technology, culture, and the willingness to adapt can decide the fate of nations. As Japan rebuilt from the ashes of World War II, the lessons learned in the mud and jungle of the Pacific would shape not only its own future, but the future of the world. By the late 1940s and 1950s, Japan was a nation transformed. The old doctrines of muscle and sacrifice had given way to a new era of mechanization and efficiency. American construction companies, working alongside Japanese engineers, brought bulldozers, cranes, and power tools to the rebuilding of cities, roads, and factories. The same machines that had once been symbols of defeat became the engines of recovery and growth. Yamamoto, now a civil engineer, watched as his country embraced the very technology that had once seemed so alien. He saw highways built in months, skyscrapers rising where bombed-out ruins had stood, and factories humming with the sound of automated assembly lines. The lessons of Guadalcanal were everywhere. Efficiency mattered more than suffering, machines could do the work of thousands, and the future belonged to those who could adapt. But the change was not just technical, it was deeply cultural. The old virtues of endurance and sacrifice were still honored, but they were no longer the only measure of worth. A new generation of Japanese workers and engineers grew up believing that comfort, safety, and innovation were not signs of weakness, but of progress. The idea that hardship was a virtue faded, replaced by a belief in the value of human life and the power of collective effort. The impact of mechanization went far beyond construction. It changed the way Japan and the world thought about war, work, and society. The bulldozer became a symbol of the new Japan, powerful, efficient, and forward-looking. The same spirit of adaptation that had allowed the Americans to win on Guadalcanal now drove Japan's economic miracle, turning a devastated nation into one of the world's leading industrial powers. But the story of the bulldozer is also a warning. It reminds us that technology alone is not enough. The Americans won not just because they had better machines, but because they were willing to use them in new ways, to question old assumptions, and to value the lives of their soldiers. The Japanese lost not because they lacked courage, but because they clung to outdated doctrines and failed to adapt to a changing world. The lessons of Guadalcanal are still relevant today. In a world where technology is advancing faster than ever, the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to embrace change is more important than ever. The story of the bulldozer is a reminder that the future belongs to those who are willing to learn, to experiment, and to challenge the status quo. For modern militaries, the lesson is clear: logistics and engineering are as important as firepower and tactics. The ability to build, repair, and supply is often the difference between victory and defeat. The Americans understood this on Guadalcanal, and their example has shaped military doctrine ever since. Today's armies and navies invest heavily in engineering units, mobile workshops, and rapid construction capabilities, knowing that the ability to move and build is as important as the ability to fight. For businesses and societies, the lesson is just as powerful. The companies and countries that succeed are those that can adapt to new technologies, rethink old ways of working, and value the contributions of every member of the team. The story of the bulldozer is a call to action for leaders everywhere. Listen to your people, invest in innovation, and never be afraid to change course when the world changes around you. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the value of human life. The Americans on Guadalcanal built comfortable camps, provided hot meals, and ensured their soldiers had the tools they needed not because they were soft, but because they understood that healthy, well-fed troops fought better. They used machines to save lives, not to replace them. The Japanese, by contrast, sacrificed their soldiers in the name of honor and endurance, only to discover that suffering alone was not enough. Yamamoto, reflecting on his experiences as a prisoner, came to understand this truth. He saw that the real strength of the Americans was not just in their machines, but in their willingness to value every life, to invest in comfort and safety, and to see efficiency as a virtue rather than a weakness. He realized that the old equations, how many men to dig a trench, how many hours to build a runway, no longer applied. The future belonged to those who could harness the power of machines, not just for destruction, but for creation. As Japan rebuilt, these lessons became part of the national consciousness. The country's post-war economic miracle was built on the foundation of mechanization, efficiency, and the willingness to adapt. Japanese companies became world leaders in manufacturing, robotics, and engineering, not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future. The story of the first bulldozer on Guadalcanal is a story of transformation. It's a story about the power of innovation, the importance of adaptation, and the true cost of war. It's a reminder that the greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who are willing to learn, to change, and to build a better world. As you finish this documentary, think about what the bulldozer story means for us now. Is it a lesson in the power of technology, a reminder that the old ways are not always the best? Or simply a story of how one machine, in the hands of determined people, can change the course of history? Whatever it is, let it inspire you to face your own challenges with the same spirit of determination and hope. If you've enjoyed this journey through the story of the first bulldozer on Guadalcanal and the transformation of Japan, please like, comment, and subscribe for more untold World War II stories and deep dives into the technology and people that shaped history. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your take. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep remembering the real stories behind the legends.